It started with a simple game of spot the difference on my timeline. A viral tweet popped up showing two portraits of a woman in a cafe side by side. The caption challenged us to pick the real one. The first image was easy enough to dismiss. It had that telltale AI gloss. The skin was a little too smooth, the lighting too cinematic, the whole thing felt sterile. But the second image, that was the one everyone anchored to. It was messy. It had film grain. The lighting was imperfect, mixed with the ambient glow of the room. You could see the weight of her head in her hand, the noise you only get from a physical camera sensor struggling in low light. The comment section was flooded with people confidently declaring the second image authentic, relieved that their eyes could still spot the difference between a human moment and a generated file. But then came the reveal, and the mood in the thread shifted instantly. The poster admitted that the second image, the one with the convincing flaws, the organic texture, the one that felt true, was also AI. That specific moment of realization is terrifying because it breaks the last defense we thought we had. We've spent years training ourselves to look for six fingers or warped backgrounds, thinking that unnatural perfection was the enemy. But while we were looking for glitches, the models were learning something else entirely. They learned how to fake our imperfections. And when a machine can perfectly replicate the chaos of reality, we aren't just looking at a cool tech demo, we are looking at the end of believing is seeing.
Wow, that is the perfect way to frame this. You're taking this anecdotal, almost personal realization and just blowing it up to the systemic challenge that we are all facing right now.
It really felt that personal, like a switch flipped.
And you hit on the most critical point. We are right now entering an era where visual authenticity, what our eyes tell us, it's just not a reliable cue anymore. That gut feeling, that heuristic of, seeing is believing.
It's broken.
It's fundamentally broken by how sophisticated these AI outputs have become. So if that very foundation, our own perception, has eroded, how do we even begin to establish truth? How do we build a shared reality in this new information ecosystem?
It feels like an infocalypse, just a total cognitive crisis. We've been told for years, just think critically, that's the answer.
Right.
But when the content itself is engineered to bypass our critical faculties, we need to know how. We need to know exactly how that attack works and why it's so incredibly effective.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to do in this deep dive. It's really a two-part mission. First, we have to break down this really profound psychological study that shows just how vulnerable our brains are to these hyper-realistic rumors. The findings are they show a massive statistical failure of our cognitive resistance.
And okay, so if our own brains are failing us, statistically speaking, then the answer can't just be try harder. We have to build better tools.
That's the second part. We have to examine the countermeasures that are being built right now. We're talking about things like open cryptographic standards for content provenance, like C2PA, and even this cutting-edge fusion of AI detection with blockchain, something that can give us an auditable record of truth.
Okay, let's start with the psychology then, because the data you mentioned, it sounds genuinely shocking. It's like a map of our own weaknesses.
It really is. The researchers use a framework called the Elaboration Likelihood Model, or ELM.
The ELM.
Yeah, and it's actually a pretty elegant model for explaining how we process information that's trying to persuade us.
So how does it work?
Well, the ELM basically says our brain has two different paths it can take when it sees a message. You can almost think of it like System 1 and System 2 thinking, if you're familiar with that from behavioral science.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the fast and slow thinking.
Yeah.
So let's start with the slow one, the hard path.
That's what's called the central route. That's your System 2. It's careful, it's effortful, it's deliberative, it's logical. When you're using your central route, you're actually scrutinizing the content itself. You're looking at the quality of the argument, the logic, the evidence.
You're putting in the work.
You are putting in the work. It requires high cognitive elaboration, which means you have to be motivated and you have to be able to spend that mental energy.
But let's be real. When we're just scrolling on our phones, we're almost never doing that. We're on autopilot.
We are, and that's the other path, the peripheral route. That's your System 1. It's fast, it's intuitive, it's emotional, and it takes almost no effort.
It's all shortcuts.
All shortcuts. You're not analyzing the argument. You're just making a quick judgment based on these superficial cues. Like, does the source seem credible? Does the picture look professional? Or, do a lot of other people seem to agree with this?
Okay, so with that framework in mind, let's get to the data. The researchers analyzed, what was it, almost 12,000 comments?
Yeah, 11,942 online comments, to be exact. And they were reacting to all sorts of AI-generated rumors, fabricated disaster scenes, fake social conflicts, you name it.
And when they sorted those nearly 12,000 comments using the ELM, what did they find?
This is the finding that is just. It's an absolute indictment of relying on our own critical thinking. The data showed that an overwhelming majority, 90.5% of all of those comments, demonstrated peripheral route processing.
90.5%.
They defaulted to shortcuts.
So fewer than 1 in 10 people were actually engaging with the content logically.
Precisely. Only 9.5% of the comments showed any evidence of sexual reprocessing.
Yeah.
And a split that extreme. That's not just random noise. It's showing a systemic vulnerability. The average person's cognitive pattern is being fundamentally altered by this new kind of hyper-realistic fake.
So let's look at that huge majority, the 90%. When someone goes peripheral, what does that actually look like? What was the biggest mental shortcut they took?
The most dominant one, by a huge margin, was just raw emotional expression. It accounted for a staggering 75.1% of all those peripheral comments.
75%.
Yeah. So these users weren't asking, is this true? They were just reacting viscerally, expressing fear, anxiety, anger,
I can picture those comments perfectly. Someone sees a fake video of a dam breaking, and instead of checking it, they're just typing, "This is horrifying. The people who made this should be locked up." Or just, "This scared me to death. AI is terrifying."
Absolutely. The mechanism is designed to completely bypass the logical part of your brain and go straight for an emotional reaction. The goal is what the researchers call mass affective mobilization.
Emotional polarization.
Exactly. It's about getting a rapid spread, causing confusion, making people angry or scared. The goal isn't always to make you believe it's true. Sometimes it's just to inflame you. And by triggering that strong emotional response, the rumor has already done its job.
Okay, so emotion is the big one. What was the other major peripheral shortcut?
The second biggest was an appeal to authority or the majority. That made up about 10% of the peripheral comments. And this is basically just cognitive offloading.
Handing off the responsibility of thinking to someone else.
Yep. It showed up in two main ways. First, people would rely on official power. They'd say things like, waiting for the official announcement, or only the police can confirm this. They're basically saying, if the government hasn't said anything, I don't need to think about it.
And the second way?
Herd mentality, relying on what they thought was consensus. So many people are saying this, it must be true. They're using the crowd as their shortcut for verification.
So we've established we're mostly lazy, emotional thinkers online. But the study goes a step further, right? It's not just our fault. It's that the AI itself is actively suppressing our rational thought. This is that concept you mentioned. Technological realism.
That's the critical insight here. Technological realism. The idea is that the hyper-realistic look, the sheer visual perfection of the AI content, it systematically suppresses the two things you need for central processing: motivation and ability.
Let's break that down. How does a perfect deepfake undermine our ability to spot it?
Well, think about how we used to spot fakes. Our brains relied on finding errors, right?
Yeah, the six-fingered hand, the shadow that's pointing the wrong way.
Exactly. Those were the cognitive tripwires. They were the little glitches that made us stop and say, wait a minute, and switch into that more critical system 2 thinking. But modern AI, it minimizes those errors. It's learned the chaos of reality. It knows how film grain works, how light reflects, how hair falls.
The tripwires are gone.
The tripwires are gone, and as an average user, you just don't have the technical expertise to deconstruct a fabrication that's sophisticated. So your ability to spot the fake is severely limited.
And I guess the motivation part just follows from that. If it looks perfectly real, why would I bother spending energy to check it?
You've got it. When the content appears totally authentic, that old ingrained shortcut, seeing is believing, it just kicks in with full force. And that visual cue is so powerful, it just tanks your skepticism. If it looks real, the perceived need to spend your limited mental energy in a deep verification, that motivation, it just plummets. The AI is using its own perfection to make us mentally lazy.
That paints a really grim picture of our societal vulnerability. This goes way beyond just sharing a fake photo. This is cognitive warfare, and it has a long-term cost. The researchers call it the liar's dividend.
The liar's dividend is maybe the most insidious threat of all. It's what happens to a society after constant exposure to these perfect fakes. When you can't tell what's real anymore, you don't magically become a brilliant fact checker.
You just become a cynic. You stop trusting anything.
You become universally cynical. So if you can't trust a viral video of a politician, pretty soon you start doubting all media coverage about them. And that cynicism, it doesn't just erode trust in social media. It poisons our confidence in legitimate essential institutions. The news media, public health agencies, government announcements, even election results.
Could you give me an example?
Sure. Think about a public health crisis. If deepfakes of doctors spreading false information start circulating, the cynicism that creates makes people doubt the authentic advice coming from the CDC or the WHO. Or in an election, if fakes are everywhere, people start to doubt the real ballot counts. This environment of radical uncertainty, it gives a huge advantage to anyone who wants to cause chaos, because it just stops productive, good faith public debate in its tracks.
That is a staggering cost. Wow. Okay, before we move on to the solutions, let's give some credit to the minority who resisted, the 9.5%. What did their rational resistance actually look like?
Their responses are so valuable because they show us what an effective defense looks like. The largest category within that small group was logic and evidence. That made up about half, 50.3% of those rational comments.
And what were they doing? What did that look like in practice?
They were applying common sense and their own knowledge. So when a rumor circulated that a 1,000-year-old cultural site had collapsed, they didn't just get angry, they posted logical counters like, the weight distribution in that video is physically impossible for that structure, or they said it happened during the day, but the shadows clearly show it was late afternoon.
So they're spotting specific, verifiable details.
Exactly. My favorite example was one where a video supposedly showed a disaster in a specific country, but users with domain knowledge pointed out that the species of monkey in the video was native to Africa, not the location in the rumor. That's a tiny detail that requires real, effortful verification.
That's true critical thinking. And what about the very highest level of engagement you mentioned?
That was categorized as deep thinking, and it was about 20% of the central comments. These were the users who stepped back from the specific rumor to talk about the bigger picture.
The systemic issues.
Right. They were proposing things like mandatory labeling for all AI videos, or talking about the need for tougher legal penalties. And crucially, they were discussing the media literacy gap between different demographics, pointing out that while younger people might be savvy enough to spot some fakes, middle-aged or elderly users are far more vulnerable to this kind of manipulation.
And that's the perfect transition, because if 90% of us are statistically wired to be emotionally manipulated by this stuff, we can't just rely on hoping everyone gets better at critical thinking.
We can't.
We have to shift the burden of proof away from our unreliable eyes and onto something objective, verifiable technological evidence. We need the truth baked right into the file itself.
We absolutely do. We need a safety net, a system that protects us against the fundamental breakdown of seeing is believing.
So if we can't trust our eyes, we have to trust the math. This brings us to the technological counter-revolution, which is all about content provenance. And the big global initiative here is the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, or C2PA. What is the standard trying to do?
C2PA is a huge cross-industry effort. It's an open technical standard designed to be a globally adopted opt-in method for verifying the origins and the history of digital content. Images, video, audio, you name it. The core mission is just to create a digital chain of custody.
So that any piece of media comes with its own little story, its own content credentials.
Exactly. It tells you where it's been, from creation all the way to you, the consumer.
But I have to ask the obvious skeptical question. It's opt-in. Why should we trust this? Want the bad actors, the people spreading rumors, just not use it?
That's a fundamentally critical question. And the answer is C2PA isn't really designed to catch the bad guys who opt out. It's designed to protect the integrity of content from legitimate sources.
So journalists, documentarians, government agencies.
Right, and ethical creators. It gives them a cryptographic way to prove their content is authentic. So if a news photo has a valid, untampered C2PA credential, you can confirm its origin. But if a viral video of a building collapsing has no credential, that absence becomes a really powerful warning sign. It signals potential untrustworthiness.
Okay, so let's get into the mechanics. A content credential, or a C2PA manifest. It's more than just metadata, right? It contains what they call assertions. What kind of information is in there?
The assertions are the heart of the whole system. They're verifiable statements about the asset's entire life. This includes things like origin data, so what device created it, the time, maybe even the GPS location.
A full history of every edit, too.
A full history, a log of every major edit, what specific tools were used, like which version of Photoshop or which specific AI model, and who performed the edit. There's also a mandatory disclosure if generative AI was used at any point. It's incredibly detailed.
That is an extensive history. But digital files are easy to change. How does C2PA make sure that this manifest and the content itself are tamper-evident?
They use very robust cryptographic chaining. The manifest and the content it's describing are secured using cryptographic hashes and digital signatures. And they don't just hash the final file. They use standard algorithms like SHA-2256, but they combine them in a way that's like a Merkle tree.
Okay, hold on. Merkle tree-like approach. Let's unpack that because that sounds key to the integrity of this.
It is. Think of it like this. A Merkle tree is just a mathematical way to securely and efficiently verify a large amount of data. In the C2PA context, every single assertion in the manifest, every little piece of its history, gets its own unique digital fingerprint, a hash.
Yeah.
Then those individual fingerprints are bundled together and hashed again. That resulting hash is then combined with the hash of the actual image data itself, and that forms a final root hash. The entire structure is then digitally signed by the creator.
So why is that better than just putting a single hash on the final file?
Because it creates this unbreakable chain of custody. If you change a single pixel in the image hash changes, the final root hash fails validation. But more importantly, if you try to go in and delete just one assertion, say you want to hide the fact that you used AI, the whole cryptographic chain breaks instantly. Any change, no matter how small, invalidates the signature.
So C2PA confirms that the history of the file is authentic and hasn't been messed with. But we have to repeat that really important limitation you mentioned earlier.
Yes. This is so important. C2PA is a history keeper, not a truth detector. It confirms the chain of custody is intact, but it cannot determine if the content depicts objective truth or is factual.
So if a trusted journalist signs a credential that says, I took this photo of an apple, C2PA just confirms that the signature is valid and the file hasn't changed.
Right. It relies on your existing trust in that journalist. And conversely, if a known malicious source signs a credential saying, I created this fake disaster image, C2PA verifies that the image came directly from them, giving you a clear signal that the provider is not trustworthy.
Okay, what about durability? Files get compressed, platforms strip metadata, people take screenshots. How does a content credential survive in the wild?
That's the challenge of what they call durability via soft binding. Ideally, the manifest is embedded right inside the file's metadata, but C2PA knows that's fragile, so soft bindings create a backup.
How does that work?
It means the credential can be reassociated with the content, even if it's been stripped out. This can be done with things like invisible watermarking or through a secure lookup service, where a unique fingerprint of the asset can be matched against a database to retrieve the original content credential.
So provenance tracking is proactive, but what about the millions of deepfakes that are already out there? Or the ones made by bad actors who will just strip all this data out? That's where detection comes in, right?
Yeah.
And often that's being enhanced by things like blockchain.
That is the necessary second line of defense. Standard deepfake detection models, they often operate in these centralized, opaque silos. It's a black box. A system tells you a video is 98% fake, and your first question is, says who? And why should I trust your model?
Right. So we need to integrate detection with systems that are more transparent and auditable.
Exactly.
Walk me through that architecture. What's the AI doing on the detection side?
Well, the AI is usually a highly specialized neural network. A popular choice is the exception model, which is really efficient for frame-by-frame binary classification, basically, deciding if each frame is real or fake. And to make this model robust and also respect privacy, it's often trained using a framework called federated learning.
What's the benefit of federated learning here?
Federated learning lets the model train across a bunch of different devices or organizations without the raw data ever leaving its source. The nodes only share model updates, not the actual suspicious images or videos. This protects user privacy while letting the model learn from a massive, diverse data set, making it much harder to fool.
Okay, so detection is one thing. But if you're going to use this in court, you need to be able to show why the AI made its decision. How do you get past that black box problem?
That's the job of something called GradCam. It stands for Gradient-Weighted Class Activation Mapping. And it's an essential step for explainability, which is essential for trust. It produces a visual, a heat map, that it overlays on the original image.
And what does that heat map show you?
It visualizes the exact regions in the image that contributed most to the AI's prediction. So if a system flags a political speech as a deepfake, the GradCam heat map might light up the borders of the mouth, the eye contours, or the blurry areas where the fake face was stitched onto the real body. It gives a judge, or just you, a visual explanation for the fakeness score.
Okay, so we have the AI detecting the fake and explaining why. How does the blockchain part make this whole process tamper-proof?
The blockchain provides the immutable record, all the key results, the real fake label, the confidence score, a timestamp, and a cryptographic hash of the input image. All that gets packaged up and stored immutably on a ledger, usually the Ethereum blockchain, using smart contracts.
So the results can't be changed after the fact.
They can't. But storing huge video files on Ethereum is insanely expensive, so they use something else for the actual media.
And that's where IPFS comes in.
That's where IPFS, the interplanetary file system, comes in. The original media file and that crucial GradCam heat map are uploaded to IPFS. And IPFS doesn't use URLs, it uses content addressing. It gives each file a unique CID, a content identifier, based on the file's contents.
And that CID is what's recorded on the blockchain.
Exactly.
That's brilliant. So if the CID is on the blockchain, you know the heat map you're pulling from IPFS is the exact one the AI used. If the file changed even a tiny bit, the CID would change and it wouldn't match the record on the blockchain.
It creates this fully auditable loop. The integrity of the result is secured by the blockchain, and the integrity of the evidence, the heat map, is secured by IPFS. Together, they give us that verifiable, mathematically robust history we need to bypass our own flawed perception.
The hyper-realism of AI is forcing us to build these incredibly advanced defenses, and they are absolutely necessary because the risks we're facing are profound. They go way beyond just, simple misinformation online. Let's talk about the risks that are pushing policymakers to finally act.
Yeah, the most immediate and financially devastating risk is malicious impersonation and financial fraud. These sophisticated deepfakes are making identity theft and corporate spying so much easier. The fidelity of the cloned voices, the deepfake video, it just bypasses security hurdles that used to work.
We've seen some absolutely staggering corporate examples of this, right?
We have. There are cases where attackers use sophisticated voice cloning to impersonate a CEO, calling the finance department and demanding an urgent wire transfer of millions of dollars to a fraudulent account. And it works because it sounds exactly like the CEO. And on a personal level, grandparent scams are exploding because of this.
Where they impersonate a relative in crisis.
Exactly. And because the audio is so convincing, it just leverages that raw emotional peripheral root processing we talked about earlier.
And then there's the huge risk to democracy. Political disinformation. The ability to generate convincing content at scale is a total game changer.
It's not just about one viral video anymore. GenAI allows for the automated production of thousands of micro-targeted, personalized deepfakes. We're seeing AI-generated robocalls that impersonate candidates.
Like the deepfake audio of President Biden that tried to discourage voters in a primary election.
Precisely. Or using fabricated endorsements from respected local figures to mislead voters. And these efforts are often specifically targeted to suppress participation among certain groups like women or people of color by exploiting existing social vulnerabilities.
But the categories of harm that seem to get the fastest legal response are those involving synthetic CSAM and NCII, child sexual abuse material and non-consensual intimate imagery.
The proliferation here is a genuine crisis. GenAI tools make it terrifyingly easy to create and distribute synthetic non-consensual intimate imagery, or NCII. This causes profound, life-altering damage, mostly to women and minors. And the sheer volume of synthetic CSAM is just overwhelming law enforcement. Even when it's fabricated, it diverts critical resources and, tragically, might even increase the market demand for real abusive material.
So given these massive risks, the tech is crucial. But you need policy for enforcement. And this brings us to a really difficult problem, the transparency tension. The tools we build for truth can often collide directly with our right to privacy.
This is the very thin tightrope that regulators are trying to walk. We want transparency, we want to know the history of a file, but getting that transparency often requires collecting data in a way that violates our privacy norms.
Let's talk about how provenance tracking conflicts with a core privacy principle, data minimization.
So data minimization says you should only collect the absolute minimum amount of personal data you need for a specific purpose. But provenance tracking, by its very design, requires the exact opposite.
It requires collecting more data.
A lot more data. Device IDs, user edits, GPS locations, maybe even unique behavioral markers embedded in watermarks. If any of that is considered personally identifiable information, or PII, then the need to track history is in direct conflict with the mandate to minimize data collection.
And we saw this same tension when we were talking about detection tools for AI scams. That raises the problem of privacy invasive enforcement.
Yes. The technical fix for AI scam calls, using real-time AI to detect a cloned voice, it sounds great. But to implement it effectively, you'd need a massive centralized monitoring system.
Meaning third parties, like telecom companies, would have to be analyzing our private phone calls at scale.
Right. And that level of mass surveillance, even for a good cause, raises huge constitutional and civil liberties questions about our right to private communication. The cure could be just as invasive as the disease.
And finally, there's the retention conflict. Provenance data has to last a long time to be useful, but privacy law often says data has to be deleted.
For provenance to work for, say, historical archives or journalistic records, those content credentials need to be kept for decades, maybe indefinitely. But data protection laws often give you the right to have your personal data erased. So if a user's device ID is linked to a manifest, the societal need for a verifiable history directly clashes with the individual's right to privacy. It's a really tough problem to solve.
So policy measures like mandatory labeling are one of the main tools being used to try and fix this.
They are, and there's a broad consensus that we need laws that either mandate disclosure when content is synthetic or that ban specific harmful uses, like the Tennessee Elvis Act, which protects your voice likeness. The problem is, when you rely on labeling, you run straight into the labeling paradox.
Let's explain the mechanism of this paradox, because it's a tricky one.
The paradox comes from who complies. The good faith actors, the ethical creators, journalists, responsible companies, they're the ones who will follow the law. They'll attach the C2PA credentials, they'll add the watermarks.
But the bad faith actors, the rumor mongers, they'll just ignore it.
They'll intentionally remove the labels or just never apply them in the first place.
Do you end up in a world where all the honest content is labeled, but the malicious fake content is unlabeled? What does that do to the user?
It completely shifts their skepticism. Users start to scrutinize the labeled content, the stuff that's being honest about its origins, while the unlabeled, pristine, hyper-realistic fake gets a free pass. The label, which was meant to be a sign of transparency, becomes a target for suspicion. It destroys the trust signal for the very people who are trying to do the right thing.
This whole cycle just confirms what we talked about in the beginning. Technology can be circumvented. Policy relies on people choosing to So the final line of defense has to be internal. It has to be cognitive resilience.
Absolutely. Given that 90.5% default rate to emotional shortcuts, we have to admit the primary failure is cognitive, not technical. Public education needs to shift. We have to move from just teaching fact-checking to training people on how their own brains work. We need to move from content moderation to cognitive assistance.
So we need to teach people to recognize the feeling of being manipulated as the final tripwire.
Precisely. You have to train yourself to recognize that intense emotional reaction, that surge of fear or rage or disgust you feel when you see something online, as a critical warning sign, a sign that you are defaulting to that fast peripheral system 1 processing. That emotion means you're being manipulated.
And the learned habit has to be to just slow down, to force a moment of system 2 thinking.
The imperative is to pause, to defer sharing, and to actively seek out cross-verification. You have to impose the rational central root onto that highly emotional system 1 moment. If we can condition ourselves to just habitually pause whenever we feel that intense emotion from a piece of media, we start to reclaim our ability to fight back against the manipulation that technological realism has weaponized against us. The battle for truth, at its core, is a battle for our own cognitive effort and attention.
This has been an incredibly thorough deep dive into what is, I think, arguably the defining information crisis of our time. To bring this all together, generative AI has basically weaponized hyper-realism to exploit our emotional shortcuts, causing this 90.5% default to cognitive laziness when we see disinformation.
And that systemic vulnerability means we need a technological safety net. We looked at that powerful dual approach of C2PA, which uses cryptography to guarantee a tamper-evident history for content, and advanced detection systems that combine AI models with explainability tools and the immutable ledger of blockchain.
But we also have to recognize that tech and policy alone aren't enough. They're tangled up in the transparency tension and the labeling paradox. The ultimate line of defense really does rest with you, the listener, and our ability to cultivate our own cognitive resilience.
The core challenge is psychological. It's about deciding whether we're going to prioritize ease and emotional reaction and allow ourselves to be exploited, or if we're going to commit to the verifiable, mathematically robust truth offered by these provenance systems, backed by a conscious choice to actually engage in critical thought.
So here's the final thought for you to carry forward from this deep dive. The true value of tools like C2PA and blockchain provenance is that they use the weapon of technological realism against itself. They leverage the mathematical certainty of cryptography to build an objective, verifiable history that completely bypasses the emotional and flawed human perception that AI is now so supremely adept at manipulating. We are building systems that demand certainty in a world designed for doubt.